This is Dr.RED Panda.
Did you know that besides black slaves, there were also many white slaves in history? Where were these enslaved white people sent? And who enslaved them? Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Red Panda. In this video, I will explore the answers to these questions for you. The Moors and the two pirates. The story begins in 15th century Spain, when the country was at its peak. With its powerful military, Spain's territory was constantly expanding, forcing many Moors to abandon their homes and flee to North Africa. Since most of North Africa is desert, life was very difficult for these Moors. It wasn't until the early 16th century that two brothers, DR.RED and Selim Reis, emerged to lead the Moors out of their dilemma. At first, they were just small-time pirates dreaming of building their own crew. So they recruited these homeless Moors and started making a living by robbing others. Because their main area of operation was called the Barbary coast, this group of Moorish pirates became known as the Barbary pirates. Their rise also caught the attention of the Ottoman Empire, which was facing a huge problem at the time: a massive population decline due to the Black Death. Support for the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Selim I was as restless as ants on a hot pan, constantly pondering ways to bolster his population. Thus, the emergence of Barbary pirates was like a life-saving straw in his eyes. Operating primarily in what is now Algeria, a territory within the Ottoman Empire's sphere, Selim I began covertly supporting these pirates, urging them to plunder while also bringing in people. Thus, the abominable slave trade was born. This slave trade differed significantly from the well-known triangular trade. Due to the proximity of the Barbary coast to Europe, pirates mainly raided European merchant ships, resulting in the enslavement of white people. This phase of the slave trade is also known as the white slave trade. The Reis brothers not only had to handle tasks assigned by the Sultan but also evade pursuit by the formidable Spanish Armada, as the Moors had historical grievances with the Spanish. Under the command of the Reis brothers, both sides engaged in fierce combat, but ultimately, it was the Barbary pirates who emerged victorious. As the victors, they seized the opportunity to plunder the coastal regions of Spain extensively. Upon returning home, the Reis brothers presented their spoils to the Sultan, while the Moors satisfied their own vendettas. With this triumph, the Barbary pirates finally obtained the wealth code and began their livelihood of raiding for slaves. However, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, all relatively close to them, were major hubs for the slave trade. Yet, these three countries were not densely populated, and the Barbary pirates were inclined towards resource sustainability. So, after plundering these three nations, what could they do next? The pirates had a revelation. Instead of continually focusing on these three countries, they could broaden their horizons. Thus, other European nations gradually came into their sights. The peak era of Barbary pirates. By the 17th century, the Reis brothers had long passed away, yet the Barbary pirates had risen to their pinnacle of power. Initially preying on coastal towns and villages of mainland Europe, they eventually expanded their reach northward, reaching countries as far as Iceland and the Netherlands. Their elusive nature made capturing them an exceedingly difficult task, even for maritime powers like England, known as the empire on which the sun never sets. Did European nations have no means to control them? It wasn't for lack of trying, but rather due to the fact that they simply couldn't. The collaboration between the Ottoman Empire and the Barbary pirates, fueled by the slave trade, bolstered economic development in both regions. This made neighboring countries, already envious of the proximity to the Barbary coast, eager to partake in this lucrative trade. Consequently, nations bordering the North African coast, such as Tunisia, Tripoli, Morocco, and Sudan, forged close alliances with the Barbary pirates, becoming veritable pirate states. To facilitate this cooperation, local governments turned a blind eye to the pirates' activities. As long as the pirates paid their dues in taxes on plundered goods, even if pursued by enemies, local authorities would intervene to shield them, emboldening the pirates to operate with impunity. During the late 17th century and early 18th century, England was plagued by internal turmoil, with conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, Royalists and Republicans leading to ongoing civil strife. Exploiting this instability, Barbary pirates seized opportunities to raid the British Isles repeatedly. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1631 when the pirates brazenly assaulted the Irish city of Baltimore. They massacred all the elderly and infants within the city, while capturing the remaining inhabitants to be sold as slaves in North Africa. When British envoys attempted negotiation, the pirates offered only two options: ransom for release or no negotiation at all. The other main culprit is the Crimean Conate. The Crimean Conate, a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, was notorious for its slave trade, even more so than the Barbary pirates. At the height of the slave trade, the Kanate's main source of revenue came from raiding and selling slaves. Without it, the Conate could barely sustain itself. The first large-scale raid by the Crimean Conate was in 1468, when they attacked Galicia and captured 18,000 people. These captives were then sold as slaves to the Ottoman Empire, bringing in a large profit for the Khanate. Over the next 220 years, this nation would launch plundering raids on its neighboring regions almost every year. According to historical records, they returned laden with booty at least 65 times, with Poland and Russia suffering the most. To add insult to injury, the invaded nations not only suffered aggression, but their enslaved people were also treated as commodities and paraded for all to see. In the eyes of the Tatars at that time, women from different nations could be labeled according to their physical attributes. For example, German and Hungarian were considered tall and thin, lacking the strength for heavy labor, and therefore could not fetch a high price. Similarly, women from Germany and Russia were also considered cheap goods at that time. However, in the Tatars' view, the former were considered unsuitable for filling the harems of the Ottoman Empire because they were stiff-bodied and lacked femininity. The latter is due to being plundered too much, which does not conform to the principle of rarity brings value, and at the same time, Slavic people also follow this logic. What truly deserves to be considered expensive and excellent are the Circassian people who lived in the southwest of Russia at that time, a population that was very scarce. Moreover, they were mostly gentle in character, with symmetrical figures possessing aesthetic appeal. Consequently, their prices were extremely high, at least 4 times higher than those of the Slavic people. The abolition of slavery in the Ottoman Empire. With the prohibition of the transatlantic slave trade, European countries led by Britain and France began to pressure the Ottoman Empire to abolish its own slave trade. At the same time, problems caused by slavery were also intensifying within the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, the combination of external pressure and internal demand led to the demise of the Ottoman slave system. In 1830, the Ottoman Empire declared that Christians who still retained their faith after being enslaved would be freed and granted liberty. In 1846, the Ottoman Empire closed the slave market in Istanbul. However, do these actions signify the end of the slave trade in the Ottoman Empire? Certainly not. The Ottoman Empire had enjoyed the benefits of slavery for centuries, so it was not easy to completely abandon it. Furthermore, the slave trade was deeply embedded in all aspects of the Ottoman Empire at that time, making it difficult to eradicate. The abolition even led to a further increase in human rights abuses, as slave traders turned to the black market to make a profit. Although the Ottoman Empire eventually abolished slavery, it also helped to curb the empire's decline. The expansion of Ottoman slavery. Although both the Barbary pirates and the Crimean Conate were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, they had significant differences. The former primarily sought wealth, while the latter went beyond mere financial gain, also seeking power. The Crimean Conate's slave trade served not only to satisfy the needs of Ottoman aristocrats, but also to advance its own ambitions. As a result, it was highly destructive, and the country itself practiced slavery, to some extent serving as an extension of the Ottoman Empire's slave system. According to reports from Russian envoys in the mid-17th century, an ordinary Tatar owned between 10 to 20 slaves. For higher-ranking Tatars, the number of slaves they possessed was even higher, sometimes exceeding 100. After being enslaved, Most of these white slaves had to endure extremely heavy workloads, with some employed in agricultural production. Day and night, they toiled in the southern regions of the Crimean Peninsula. Some were used in livestock management and industry, simultaneously herding animals and digging wells. In cases where slave owners had more slaves than they could utilize in their own households, they would even rent out their slaves to Christians for labor. Once they had profited enough and could not extract any more value, they would then sell them off. Additionally, Europeans had little ground to condemn the slave trade in the Ottoman Empire. On one hand, they themselves were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, selling African slaves to the Americas, which resulted in Africa losing over 100 million young laborers in the triangular trade. On the other hand, many European countries were also patrons of the slave system. For instance, Italy had purchased numerous slaves from the Crimean Conate. Consequently, they found it difficult to denounce Barbary pirates for plundering them. In the case of countries like Italy and Europe, they too had their own hardships to bear. Amidst the devastating toll of the Black Death, which ravaged populations across nations, there was a dire shortage of labor. Compounding this, they had to endure raids by Barbary pirates and suffer losses from incessant wars. To sustain their national development under such circumstances, purchasing slaves became almost necessary. This helps explain the awkward situation where many European countries found themselves being plundered on one hand and resorting to buying slaves from other nations on the other. During the peak of the slave trade, how common were slaves exactly? Taking Bursa, an economic powerhouse of the Ottoman Empire, as an example, historians have found that nearly 25% of the town's population were slaves. Additionally, 15% of the residents were once slaves before being emancipated, and some other residents were descendants of slaves. Therefore, if a strict distinction is to be made, the real local residents may not even account for 50%. This is just a microcosm of the towns and villages of the Ottoman Empire, large and small, which shows how prevalent the slave trade was at that time. Of course, from a modern perspective, the slave trade is undoubtedly full of blood and sin, and should be resisted and condemned. Fortunately, in 1783, when Russia annexed Crimea, the Tatars, the main suppliers of slaves in the white slave trade, disappeared, finally putting an end to the dark slave trade. Even in the 21st century, slavery or disguised slave trade still exists in various parts of the world. For example, the notorious dark web is filled with a large number of clandestine transactions that cannot be seen on the surface, including the slave trade. Therefore, we are still fighting against this crime that tramples on life, and we will continue to fight. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm DR.RED Panda. If any of you have your own perspectives, or if you think there are any errors in the video, feel free to leave a comment in the discussion section. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.